The summer the Harwick Valley aquifer failed, 31 families drove their livestock to the sale barn in a single week, and the county seat smelled of desperation and diesel all the way to the courthouse steps. It was the kind of heat that did not arrive so much as install itself, the way a stone sets into mortar, permanent and indifferent. And the pastures that had been green in April were the color of old paper by the last week of June. On the morning the Community Water Authority called its emergency session in the Grange Hall, every folding chair was taken and men stood 3 deep against the walls, and the ceiling fans only moved the hot air from one side of the room to the other without cooling any of it. At the front of the room, behind the long table draped in the authority's banner, sat Edmund Rawls, the regional director of Consolidated Rural Holdings, in a jacket that had no business being pressed that well in that heat. And he had a yellow legal pad and a pen, and a manner that suggested he had already written down everything that was going to happen and was simply waiting for the room to catch up to his notes. And at the back of the room, standing near the door because every chair was taken, stood a woman named Cora Beale, 34 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of her, with soil worked into the creases of her knuckles, and her dark hair pinned up with what appeared to be a short piece of baling wire. She held a mason jar of water she had brought from home. Nobody had thought to offer her a seat. Nobody in that room thought she was anything other than a footnote. The real verdict, though, had been delivered 14 months before, not by any person in that hall, but by 58 acres of tangled ground and a small herd of animals that everyone in Harwick Valley had already written off as a joke. The land remembers, as old Petros Sava had told her that first autumn, what those who work it have forgotten, and it only speaks in a whisper, so you must go quiet enough to hear it. She had gone quiet. That was the whole of it, and the whole of it had been enough. 14 months before the emergency session, on a Tuesday in late April that smelled of rain that had not arrived yet, Cora Beale paid $11,200, which was nearly everything she had, for a tax deed on a parcel the county had been trying to move for 3 years with no takers. The parcel was 58 acres on the eastern slope of the Harwick Ridge, and it was not so much a farm as an argument for the futility of farming. The previous owner had walked away from it 6 years before without a backward look, and in those 6 years Wisteria had come in the way Wisteria does, without invitation and without mercy, covering the old fence lines and the collapsed equipment shed and climbing the 3 remaining oaks until their canopies were roped in purple flowering vines as thick as a man's forearm. The access track was barely distinguishable from the surrounding brush. The house was a rectangle of 4 walls and a sound roof, and not much else. There was no reliable water source shown on the county survey, which was a polite way of saying the county surveyor had not walked the lower third of the property because the lower third of the property was a tangle so dense a man could lose his head in it and not find it till November. At the same auction, a livestock consignment was being dispersed from the estate of a man named Burden, who had kept goats the way some men keep habits, without a clear plan and with consequences that outlasted him. The herd was 41, Kiko Cross does, 2 bucks, and 11 weanlings, 54 animals in various conditions, and the bidding was so reluctant, it was almost a silence with numbers in it. Kikos were not fashionable in the valley. The valley ran cattle and always had, and the opinion of Kikos among the valley's cattlemen was something between mild contempt and outright bafflement. Goats ate brush, people said, as though that were an accusation. Cora paid $3,100 for all 54 of them, and when the auctioneer read the total out, the man beside the chute made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cough, but was entirely a verdict. She had $1,400 left in the world. The arithmetic of breath, she called it in her own mind, because that was what it was. The number of dollars she had left minus the number of dollars she needed to get from one month to the next, and the answer for a long time was going to be a very small number held over a very large need. She drove them up to the Ridge property in a borrowed trailer that afternoon, the 54 goats shifting and complaining behind her, and she unloaded them through the gap where the gate had been and stood in the failing light, and looked at what she had bought. It looked like the inside of a problem. The wisteria moved slightly in the ridge wind, as if breathing, and somewhere under all of it, the land held whatever it held, and it was not saying yet. She had a tent, a camp stove, 2 weeks of provisions, a modest collection of hand tools, and enough fencing material to establish one paddock. She put the paddock nearest the house and spent the first 3 days repairing the 4 walls and the roof, enough to sleep under them. And on the 4th day she began the work of learning 58 acres she had purchased, without ever walking more than a quarter of them. The goats required nothing from her in those first weeks, except that she opened the paddock gate each morning and closed it each evening. They were Kikos, which meant they had evolved for exactly this kind of country, and they went into the wisteria the way water goes downhill, which is to say without any opinion about it, because it was simply what they did. By the end of the first week there was a swath of cleared ground along the north fence that had not been visible ground in 6 years. The goats did not merely eat the vines. They stripped the bark from the stumps and ate the seedlings and ate the roots where the roots were shallow and returned the next morning to eat what they had missed. They were, she came to understand, a particular kind of patient. Edmund Rawls came on a Friday in early May, driving a clean white truck up the access track with the confidence of a man who has never had difficulty going where he wanted to go. He stepped out and surveyed the situation, which was a woman in work clothes, 54 goats, and a property that still looked, from the track, like a botanical catastrophe. He introduced himself as the regional director for Consolidated Rural Holdings, which ran 32,000 acres of the valley's best bottomland and had been acquiring parcels on the ridge for 2 years. He had a business card and an extended hand and a smile that was doing more work than smiles are designed to do. He said that he understood she had taken on quite a project and that it was a brave thing, a real brave thing, and that the holdings would be glad to take the parcel off her hands at 12,000, which was more than she had paid in taxes, technically, and would let her make a clean start somewhere more suitable. He said it the way a doctor says something is going to pinch. She told him he was not interested. He said to keep the card. She put the card in the breast pocket of her shirt and went back to what she was doing. The feed store in Harwick was a place where opinions moved as freely as dust, and the opinion that circulated through May and into June was that the woman who had bought the old ridge parcel, the one up above the Sava place, the one that was nothing but vine and trouble, had made a peculiar investment and had paid an odd price for it and had stocked it with an animal the valley did not take seriously, and that the whole enterprise had the shape of a thing that would be resolved inside of a year, when she sold out and the holdings picked it up for what it was worth, which was not much, but which was more than whatever she could make of it. The men who said this were not cruel, mostly. They were experienced, which sometimes comes to the same thing. The arithmetic of breadth that first May was $218 in hand against a monthly shortfall of roughly $400, and she was running that equation every morning the way some people run their prayers, because it was the truth of her situation, and she had always found it better to look at the truth directly. She supplemented by taking odd work 2 days a week at a nursery in the next county, and she kept her spending to the minimum that survival required. And every week the goats cleared a little more ground, and every week the picture of what the land might be became slightly clearer, and she stayed quiet enough to keep reading it. Petroseva came in September. He lived a quarter-mile below her on the ridge, a man of 77 years who had come from somewhere in Eastern Europe as a young man and had kept bees for 5 decades and spoke English in a slow accented cadence that made everything he said sound like it had been stored in amber first. He walked up one morning with a jar of honey, and no particular announcement of himself, just appeared at the edge of her cleared ground as though he had grown there. And he looked at what the goats had done to the wisteria, and he said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "They eat what the land does, not want to keep and leave what it does." She said she had noticed that. He said old country saying, "The best farmer is the one who walks the land in the evening and listens," because in the evening the land speaks slow enough for a person to understand. She said she had been doing something like that. He handed her the honey and looked at the cleared slope, which was revealing itself acre by acre as a south-facing hillside with a particular kind of clay-rich but permeable soil, the kind that moved water rather than holding it. And he said, "You have not gone to the bottom yet." She said, "Not yet." He said, "When you do, go slow and go quiet." And then he went home. She went to the bottom of the property in October, pushing through the last of the wisteria on the lower third. And she went slow and she went quiet. And on the third day of working the lower ground, she found it. A seep, first about 20 yards up from the lowest point, a place where the soil was dark and soft, even in October, when everything else on the ridge had dried back, and moss growing on the north side of a limestone shelf that had no business being that green. She dug a test hole. Water rose into it within 20 minutes. She sat beside it and looked at it for a while. She did not tell anyone. This was not a decision she made consciously, so much as an instinct she obeyed. The same instinct that makes you cup a flame in the wind before you know whether it is going to hold. She was banking it, the way you bank a coal low under ash, keeping it from the air that would either feed it to a blaze before its time or smother it with too much attention. The land had spoken, and she was the only one listening, and for now, that was how it needed to stay. By November, the herd had cleared 41 of the 58 acres. The cleared ground was extraordinary in a way she had not dared to predict, because the wisteria, for all its aggression, had been adding organic matter to that slope for 6 years, and what the goats left behind was ground that was aerated and amended in a way that would have cost a working farmer real money to achieve. The south-facing hillside was already greening with native grasses she had not seeded, because the seed bank in the soil had been waiting under the vines for years. And now it had light and it came up on its own, as though the land had been planning this and had simply needed the vines removed to proceed. She began moving the herd in a rotation pattern she worked out herself over several weeks of watching where they grazed with enthusiasm and where they grazed with reluctance, because their reluctance was always information. The arithmetic of breath had improved. She was running a shortfall of 160 a month instead of 400, and the trend was moving in the right direction, and the seep at the bottom of the property, which she visited every morning now, had widened into a basin the size of a dining table and showed no sign of diminishing. The boy appeared in December. His name was Fen, and he was 10 years old, and he lived with his grandmother a half-mile down the road in a house that did not look as though it was winning its argument with the weather. He walked up one afternoon when she was moving fence panels, and he stood and watched for a while, and then, without being asked, he picked up the other end of the panel she was struggling with and helped her set it. She said, "Thank you." He said, "What are they called?" She said, "Which ones?" Meaning there were 54 of them. And he meant which ones were called something specific, because he was already looking at them the way a person looks at things that are going to be important. She had not named any of them, which she suddenly felt was an oversight. Over the following weeks, Fen named them all. The senior buck, a gray-muzzled, broad-chested animal of 5 years, who moved through the herd with the unhurried authority of something that had decided long ago it did not need to prove anything. Fen named Almanac, and it was exactly right, and she could not have said why, but it was. Fen came every day after school, and on weekends he came in the mornings, and he was quiet in the way of a child who has learned that quiet is often the safest register, and he was useful in the way of a child who has learned that usefulness is the best currency available to him. And he named every animal and remembered every name, and never once expressed any opinion about goats being an unusual or inferior thing to keep. Edmund Rawls came back in January with a revised offer. The holdings had consolidated 3 additional parcels on the ridge, and her 58 acres now represented a gap in their planned road access corridor, which gave him a motivation he had not had in May. He offered $22,000, and he said it warmly. and with the implication that this was a number she ought to feel grateful for, that this was a number reflecting the holdings' goodwill toward her situation. She said she was not interested. He said he understood. These things took time, and he drove back down the track, and she watched his white truck go and then went back to fencing. She had not shown him the lower third. Nobody had seen the lower third. The basin was now 8 feet across and a foot deep in places, and the water was cold and clear, and she had brought in an independent water quality test under a neighbor's name, paying $50 she did not easily have, and the results had come back clean on every measure that mattered. A woman from Milford County named Tessie Drohan drove up in late February in a truck that had a catering company's name on the door, and she had heard, she said, from a cousin who had heard from someone at the nursery that there was a woman on the Harwick Ridge keeping Kiko goats, and whether there was any possibility of sourcing whole animals or carcass. For a restaurant supply account she was developing, Cora sold her 4 wethers she had been finishing on the improved pasture at a price per pound she named, with only a slight internal hesitation, because the price was higher than the county sale barn price by 40%, and she did not know if Drohan would accept it. Drohan said that was fair, and wrote a check and loaded the animals without complaint, and said she would be back in 6 weeks. She drove away, and Cora stood in the cleared pasture and looked at the check, and then at the herd, and then at Almanac, who was standing in the middle of the south field in the February sun, looking like something that had been there forever, and she thought that the land had just said something clearly enough for anyone to hear. Except that no one else had been listening, she told Petro that evening, bringing him a portion of the payment as repayment for a small loan he had made her in November, that he had said was not a loan, but that she treated as one. He accepted the money without argument, which meant he understood her. He said, "The old people said, a still pond tells you more than a running stream, because the running stream is already going somewhere and the pond is still deciding." She thought about that for a long time. Tessie Drohan came back in April and again in May, and by June the shortfall in the arithmetic of breath had become a surplus of $300 per month, and she had put $2,000 of the accumulated surplus into improving the fencing on the lower third and building a clean collection structure around the basin, a simple gravity-fed system that could fill 2 500-gallon tanks from the natural outflow. And she had the water tested again, independently, under her own name this time. And it was what she had suspected, which was a spring of exceptional mineral clarity and consistent temperature and output, running at something between 12 and 15 gallons per minute, even in the dry back end of the previous autumn. The summer came in like the open door of a furnace. That was the only way to account for it, the way June simply opened a door that nobody could close, and behind that door was a heat, so specific and relentless that it was almost a presence rather than a condition, something that had arrived with intentions. The valley's ponds dropped. The county's 2 main stock wells, which fed the lower bottomland operations run by the holdings and by 12 independent ranching families, began drawing from diminished pressure by the middle of June, and by the 4th of July the smaller of the 2 had gone dry and the larger was showing sand. The aquifer that had served the valley since before anyone currently living had been born was failing, and it was failing fast, and the County Water Authority called its first session on July 9th, and Consolidated Rural Holdings sent Edmund Rawls. And Rawls had a plan that was the same plan institutions always have when an emergency gives them the leverage they could not buy in a normal market. He proposed that the holdings would broker the emergency water trucking operation for all 31 affected families, consolidating the purchase of water and the routing of trucks through a single authority, which would be the holdings. What? And the cost would be allocated at a rate he described as fair, but which the families who did the arithmetic quickly understood was a rate that would put most of them under a debt obligation to the holdings inside of 90 days. He explained this with sympathy. He used the word partnership 4 times in 12 minutes. One of the ranchers in the back row asked what happened to families who fell behind on the water debt, and Rawls said there were provisions. And when the rancher pressed him on what provisions, he said the legal language was in the documents, and the documents were available for review. It was, as these things always are, a mechanism of ruin, dressed in the clothes of rescue. The holdings had also, in the weeks before the session, made 3 more offers on her parcel, each escalating by increment, the last one at $41,000, and each time she had declined by telephone without elaboration. And Rawls had stopped driving up the track himself and was sending a subordinate whose manner suggested he expected to be refused and had made peace with it. She had not told the subordinate about the spring. She had not told anyone beyond Petro and Fen and Tessie Drohan about the spring, and Drohan had no reason to broadcast it, and Fen had no other community in which to broadcast it, and Petro had been keeping things to himself for 77 years as a matter of character. 2 weeks before the Grange Hall session, a rancher named Delbert Spoon came up her access track on a Tuesday morning and stood at her fence and took off his hat and held it, which is a thing a man does when he is preparing to say something that costs him something. Spoon had been the man standing at the auction chute 14 months before, making the sound that was not quite a laugh. He had 300 acres of bottomland pasture and 200 head of Angus and no water to give them that he could pay for without mortgaging the operation to the holdings. He said he had heard a rumor, and he stopped there, and she waited, and he said the rumor was that she had water. She did not confirm it immediately. She asked him where he had heard it. He said a boy, and she thought Fen, who had likely said it at school, without understanding it was a secret, because he was 10 and it had not occurred to her to tell him it was a secret, which was her oversight and not his fault. She felt no anger about it. She said she had a spring. He looked at his hat brim. He said that was something. She said it was something. He asked whether there was any possibility of arrangement. She said she would think about it and come talk to him in a few days. And he nodded and put his hat back on and thanked her and went down the track with the bearing of a man who has eaten something unpleasant and found it necessary and is trying to maintain his dignity. Doing it. She thought about it that evening, sitting on the slope above the spring basin in the last hour of light, with Almanac standing 10 feet away in the posture of a creature that has no anxieties left to manage, and she watched the water move in its quiet way out of the basin into the collection tank, and she ran the arithmetic of breath in its new form, which was not the arithmetic of her own survival anymore, but the arithmetic of what a thing is worth against what a thing is for. 12 to 15 gallons per minute was somewhere between 17,000 and 21,000 gallons per day. 31 families needed water. The holdings needed the families to need water through the holdings, in order to collect the debt that would give them the collateral to acquire the operations. She was the thing between those two facts. She understood this. She stayed on the slope until the light went, and Almanac walked slowly to the other side of the paddock and lay down. And she went inside and wrote a number of things on a piece of paper, and the next morning she walked to Petro Sava's house and knocked. Petro made tea and listened to her. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Old country saying. When the water runs freely, it belongs to the ground it comes from, and the ground it feeds. And the person who found it is not its owner, but its keeper." Adder. She said she thought that was right. He said, "You will charge them something." She said she would charge them labor, meaning she would ask the families to contribute a day's work, each to improving the access road and extending the gravity-fed pipe system down the ridge, which would serve the spring operation long after the crisis ended, and which the families would therefore have a stake in maintaining. And she would charge the water itself at what it actually cost her to run the collection and delivery system, which was a number she had already calculated and which was less than a tenth of what Rawls had proposed. Petro looked at her for a moment and said, "That is a careful answer to a greedy question." She said she thought it was the right answer. He said, "Yes, it is the right answer," and poured more tea. She sent word to Delbert Spoon and through Spoon to the other families that she had something to say at the Grange session and to give her the floor before they voted on the Holdings' proposal. Spoon delivered this message with the authority of a man who has changed his position on a matter and intends everyone to know it clearly. And the room on the morning of the session was the same room she had described at the beginning of this account, full of desperate people and one well-dressed man and a ceiling fan doing nothing useful. And she was at the back, near the door, with her mason jar of water from the spring. Edmund Rawls presented his proposal in full. He was very good at it. He used a printed document with 3 color-coded sections and a timeline, and he acknowledged the hardship of the situation with an expression that had been carefully engineered to convey concern without containing any. And he said the Holdings stood ready to carry the valley through the crisis as partners, and he said the word partners twice more. When he finished, Delbert Spoon said that Miss Beale had something to say before the vote, and Rawls looked at Cora for the first time since she had entered the room, and the look contained, for just a fraction of a second, a recalibration, because he had known she was there and had expected her to say something about his offers on her property, which was a complaint he could dismiss, and he did not yet know it was something else. She said she had a spring-fed source on the Eastern Ridge parcel that was running at a confirmed 12 gallons per minute as of the previous week's measurement, 720 gallons per hour, and that independent water quality testing showed it clean across all relevant parameters. She named the testing firm and the date, and the findings by number. She said she was prepared to supply the Valley families at a cost that covered her actual operating expenses, and she named that number, which was per 1,000 gallons, and the room was quiet in the particular way of rooms where arithmetic is being done simultaneously by many people. Wool. She said there was one condition, which was that each affected family contribute 2 days of labor to the pipe and road infrastructure, not as payment for the water, but as investment in the infrastructure that would serve the whole Ridge community after the crisis ended. She said she expected the work to take 3 weeks, and that the spring would carry the valley's stock needs through to fall if managed carefully. Rawls said, into the quiet, that he was not aware of any water source on that parcel of that capacity, and that the Holdings had had the parcel assessed. He said it with a thin smile and the implication that she might be mistaken or might be exaggerating. She said she knew the Holdings had had it assessed because the assessment had used a figure for the SEEP's output that she had never shared with anyone representing the Holdings, a figure that turned out to be 2 gallons per minute below her own measurements, which was either a remarkable coincidence or evidence that someone had visited the lower third of her property without her permission and measured it themselves. She said she would leave the room to decide what that implied about the nature of the Holdings' interest in her parcel and in this valley. She said this without raising her voice. She said it the way she said most things, quietly and once, and then she was finished saying it, and the room decided what it meant. It decided quickly. The quality of the silence that followed was not the silence of a room processing information, but the silence of a room in which something that had been pretending to be one thing had just stopped pretending. And 31 families with desperation and common sense and the ability to add and subtract were looking at Edmund Rawls and his color-coded document with a revised interpretation of what they saw. Rawls said something about the assessment being a standard procedure, which was not the right thing to say, and Delbert Spoon said he thought the session had heard enough from the Holdings' representative, and the room agreed in the informal but absolute way that rooms agree on things when the weight of feeling becomes. Rawls gathered his documents and he left the room, and nobody rose to stop him or to follow him, and the door closed behind him, and the ceiling fan moved the air, and it did not feel cooler, but it felt somehow less oppressive. The families voted to accept her terms in the same session. Spoon organized the labor parties himself, which was fitting, and over the next 3 weeks they drove pipe down the ridge and graded the access track and built a valve system at the collection point that could be operated and maintained by anyone with a half hour of instruction. Petrosava walked up to the spring on the second day of the work parties, and stood at the basin's edge and looked at the water for a long time, and said nothing that anyone could hear, but his manner suggested he was saying something privately to the water itself, or possibly to the land, which were probably the same conversation. Fen helped everywhere, fetching and carrying and reading the flow meter, with a seriousness that the grown men respected, without quite acknowledging. On the last day of the infrastructure work, when the final connection was made and the water ran down the pipe to the first of the valley's temporary storage tanks, Spoon shook her hand with both of his, which was the first time he had offered her a hand at all, and he said he was sorry for what he had done at the auction, meaning the sound, and she said she knew what he meant and accepted it. And that was the end of it. The Consolidated Rural Holdings withdrew its remaining ridge acquisition filings in August, which Cora's county contact mentioned to her informally, and which she received as information rather than as a victory, because she did not think of it in those terms. The holdings moved its regional operations south of the county line, and Edmund Rawls was reassigned to a different territory, which Consolidated framed internally as a promotion and which everyone in Harwick Valley understood as the other thing. She did not spend any time thinking about Rawls. He had already been irrelevant to the important work since May of the previous year, and had only appeared relevant because irrelevant things sometimes make a lot of noise in a crisis. The rains came in the last week of September, not dramatically, not as a single deluge, but as a steady patient accumulation over 5 days that the valley received, in the grateful way of something that had been clenching and now unclenched. The stock ponds filled. The county wells recovered pressure by November. The valley's families kept their operations and their land and their debt-free standing, and the 3 weeks of labor they had put into the ridge infrastructure remained, a permanent benefit to the community, and the spring ran all winter as springs do, indifferent to the politics of everything that had happened around it. Simply doing what it had always been doing under the wisteria, waiting for someone to listen. She expanded the herd that fall, buying 18 additional does from 2 different breeders, and she planted the south-facing slope in a perennial forage mix that the county extension agent helped her source, at a reduced consultation fee, because the agent said he wanted to see how it worked out, which was his way of saying he respected what she had done. The herd was 72 animals by winter, all named by Fen, who had developed a nomenclature that mixed historical figures with weather events and kitchen objects in combinations that made their own private sense. Almanac remained the patriarch, moving through the expanded herd with the same unhurried authority, and on cold mornings he stood on the highest cleared point of the south slope in the early light and was visible from the valley road below, a gray-muzzled, broad-chested animal on a clean green hillside, above a property that had been vine and catastrophe 18 months before. Petrosava came up on a morning in November, bringing a second jar of honey, and they stood at the edge of the cleared upper field and looked south, toward the valley, where the light was coming in at a long late autumn angle and making everything look as though it had been considered carefully before being placed there. He asked her once whether she thought she would stay. He said he already knew she would stay. He had known since the 1st October when she had gone to the lower property and come back, and said nothing. She asked him how he had known. He said the ones who find water keep quiet about it, because they understand the water does not belong to the news of it. It belongs to the ground and to the use of it, and a person who understands that has already decided to stay whether they know it yet or not. She thought that was probably true. The old saying, he said, is that the land offers itself to the person who asks it no questions and demands nothing of it and simply pays attention to what it is already doing. She had done that. She had bought 58 acres of vine and trouble because the price was almost all she had, and she had put animals on it that everyone said were the wrong animals, and she had gone quiet when the land whispered, and she had kept the secret until it was time to share it. And then she had shared it without asking the price that circumstance would have permitted her to ask. And that sequence was, Petro said, most of what there was to know about what she had done. A woman alone on a ridge, people had said, as though alone were a condition to be pitied, as though alone meant helpless, as though the land did not count as company. The land had been counting as company all along. It had been offering what it had, leaf and root and water, and she had accepted what was offered, without demanding more. And in return, it had given her everything, which is what the land does for the people who pay attention to what it is already doing. And that was not a lesson she had taught the valley so much as a lesson the valley had finally been given the circumstance to learn. And she was in the end only the person who had been quiet enough and patient enough and still enough to be there when the land was ready to say it.